When we got together back in mid-August, it was August the 18th, I think, there were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in Belarus. Apparently former loyal regime workers seemed to be abandoning the regime. And Lukashenko's future really hung in the balance. And all eyes were on the security forces, they were on the streets, and also on Belarus's neighbors. I'm wondering what their line was going to be and how things were going to turn out there. So we fast forward 2 months. And from the outside, at least, it seems that what's developed is a standoff. Lukashenko appears to have stopped the bleeding in terms of losing elite allies. But the protesters and the pressure from citizens remains extremely strong and well organized and powerful. The outside actors have developed their positions, but on a certain level look to be having relatively little influence on the ground so far. We'll definitely want to talk about that. So in this context, it seemed a really good time to check back in and to update our understanding both of the domestic politics of what's going on and then of the international politics. And I'm delighted to say that we have a really stellar group of speakers to address those issues today. We're going to start with the domestic politics and then broaden things out. So I'm delighted to welcome Volha Charnysh from MIT, Aliaksandr Herasimenka from the University of Oxford, and Hanna Liubakova, who's a journalist, a freelance journalist in Belarus, to catch us up on developments and civil society events and all of the things that are going on the ground. And then we'll turn to two leading observers of the region in general. We have Arkady Moshes from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and Gwendolyn Sasse from ZOiS, from the Center for East European Research and International Studies in Berlin. So the idea is that each of the speakers will have about 10 minutes, and then we'll turn to the hall. My goal is to collect questions in the chat, so that we can do things in a more efficient manner. I will try and collect and summarize and group questions so that we can do it that way. So if you do have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. All right, well, without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to invite Volha to kick us off. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I will briefly review the few things that are happening in Belarus. So now 70 days of protests protests still have no signs of abating. The authorities continue to use violence and intimidation, and the number of people affected by police brutality or experiencing arrests or fines is growing. So over 11,000 people have been affected, which includes people who previously were maybe just occasional protesters. Speaking from experience of my own aunt, who's a dentist and does not regularly attend protests, having experienced a court and detention is very radicalized now. So what we are all watching for, I think, is the last few days until the deadline for Tikhanovskaya ultimatum that ends on October 25th. So basically, about a week and a half ago, the Coordination Council presented Lukashenko with 3 demands. First, he needs to announce that he will leave. Second, that the violence in the streets by the regime will stop. And third, that all political prisoners will be released. And so the ultimatum says that if these conditions are not fulfilled, and of course they won't be, Tikhanovskaya will call a national strike and protest on an even larger scale. So the date for that is October 25th. And what we see happening right now is, on the one hand, the authorities are not ready to make any concessions and are preparing for this upcoming mobilization on October 25th. The Belarusian security forces have issued warnings, even warned about using military weapons to kind of scare the public. The Minsk metro will be closing. things like that. And of course, on the side of the protesters, just following Telegram channels, there's a lot of encouragement to go into the streets again on Sunday, even though, of course, protests have been continuing even on other days throughout, and to initiate a general strike. You know, by all means, protests are not abating, and we might see an increased, you know, spike of activity by the authorities and by the protesters on the upcoming weekend on Sunday. So what is the mood in Belarus today? I'm speaking from a distance from Cambridge, Massachusetts, but talking to my family and friends in Belarus, and also drawing on some excellent research done by others. So for example, my former colleague at Belarus Digest has just published results of a survey of regular Belarusians conducted at the end of September, where he talks about basic three groups in the population. So one is the active people who support the protesters, who go in the streets themselves. So this kind of core that comes from a broad spectrum of society. And in his survey, which was designed to be nationally representative, but certainly it's, you know, challenging to really pull it off in Belarus, where sociological studies are prohibited, says that this group makes up about 42% of respondents. So this group already is very invested in the protests. They will not surrender easily. They have risked a lot. Many of them were probably already arrested once, fined, and so they will continue. And then there's a second group of population that is not supportive of the regime or Lukashenko, watching from the sidelines, and worries about the economy, the living standards, the repression. This population is probably annoyed about the Wi-Fi shutdowns, the metro closures, the crowds in the street, but they're actually, you know, I would say they're definitely not the regime supporters. So this group is rather large in his survey, about 40%. And, you know, it might grow smaller or larger as the protests continue by splitting into the other categories of population. And certainly there's still a group of Lukashenko's staunch supporters. I've met some firsthand. And so it's interesting. It's a small group, it's a minority, though its size is hard to determine. So this group simply watches and dismisses information that does not agree with their vision. So for instance, there are people who really believe that the West is encouraging protests, that Amon violence is due to Amon's own doing and not Lukashenko's encouragement, and so on. And it's also a diverse group that's present in all cross sections of society, but it's in the minority and hopefully will be getting smaller over time. I will conclude by just talking about, you know, what do we see happening and what might come next, which is, you know, rather dangerous because making predictions about this in certain situations is complicated. But, you know, it is already clear that attitudinal change is happening in Belarusian society, that people, and an increasing number of people are not willing to trade their political rights in exchange for economic stability. And the paternalism of the regime is not going to be satisfactory to them. And this group will continue growing in part because we see, you know, Belarusian economies in the deep recession due to a number of things that started way before the protests, but are exacerbated by the continuing strikes and shutdowns and general uncertainty in Belarus. So for example, foreign banks are no longer lending, IT businesses are losing a lot of money. And overall, this means that the regime was further weakened and will not be able to rescue the situation anytime soon. With handouts, with economic stability and so on. And another thing that is happening is that protests are accelerating this attitudinal changes in Belarusian society by first having, first of all, by having shows of violence in the streets by Amon. So a lot of people are witnessing this, even if they were not previously aware of the regime. it's very important that protesters themselves are non-violent, and the images of police brutality are reaching further and further circles of people. Then there's certainly unemployment. For example, some people were fired. Workers of state enterprises that were striking early in August were maybe not typically protest electorate, but now that they're fired or punished, they are becoming vectors of anti-regime support. And what we also see, I think, is that by having gone to a protest, participating with their neighborhood, there's certain new communities created of people who will continue encouraging one another and informing one another. So there are Telegram chats for neighborhoods for mutual help. There are joint attendance of protests. And so this increases social pressure on people to not give up and to participate, and expands the circle of people who are no longer apolitical and are interested in seeing change in Belarus. So these developments will further shrink the group of Lukashenko's supporters, I think, and especially this group of apolitical population in Belarus, making the return to status quo less likely. However, we don't see any indicators that institutional change is possible. So the Lukashenko regime promises constitutional reform, and it seems that there's no enthusiasm for any sort of reform, for good reasons. It's there's also some interesting developments where Lukashenko regime is trying to split the opposition. For example, so the KGB must have recruited Yuri Voskresensky, a political actor allied with Babarika earlier, that was imprisoned. And so Voskresensky seems to have switched to the regime side during his imprisonment and is now being used by Lukashenko to split the kind of support for the protesters, though it doesn't seem to be effective at the moment. So I think my time is up. I will cede the floor, and I look forward to hearing what other people think.
Wonderful, thank you. That's a great start. Aliaksandr, can we turn to you next?
Hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I will build up on amazing Volha's review and just develop her thoughts a bit in a direction of the future as well, which is perhaps one of the most intriguing questions: what's going to happen, or what might happen to this movement next? Obviously, we don't know, but there are different possibilities, options, and they are, of course, partly based on what's been happening to similar movements and organizations previously. What I would say is perhaps, in my opinion, and based on observations of similar movements in other authoritarian countries, I think that this movement, Belarusian protest movement, obviously, that started in August, it needs to build additional capacities in order to succeed in the future. So far, we kind of see this moment when it doesn't look it's really developing anywhere, right? It's sort of this state where there's a bit of uncertainty about its future. And though, like on the surface, it's been looking like it's been winning for a long period, especially in August. And obviously, the main thing most people looking at, kind of traditional, as well as many media commentators, as well as academics sometimes, it's numbers, right? People been always interested in numbers. How many people joined the protest on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so on? How many people signed a petition? How many people left police? And so on. But it's, of course, a very important question, and it's very often sends a very strong signal to the authorities that movement is strong. And indeed, Belarusian movement was strong. In terms of numbers, I don't think there is any so far kind of final credible numbers of how many people joined it. But for instance, just very recent research by Emma Mateo, who is at Manchester, at Oxford, she studied Belarusian protest, and she suggests that at least 80 towns and locations in Belarus joined the protest in first 5 days. So 80 towns, and it's actually quite a lot, and it basically suggests, and also my research also shows that in fact at least 20 largest cities been covered totally, and perhaps it's true that almost basically every location where at least 50,000 people live been covered. Belarus, sort of middle-sized European country of 9.4 million citizens, and people living there, and if we kind of try to summarize briefly, it might be that at least 10% of population, 10% of voters joined the movement. And it would mean that movement was really huge. And it would mean what it means compared to other movements. If you look at, for instance, largest post-World War II movements across the world, you find that one of the largest was in Iran, and it was when 10% joined. So in fact, a Belarusian case might be one or kind of exceptionally huge in terms of numbers, but doesn't really show that movement is really is it winning? Does it has huge potential because of just of numbers? That's what I'm questioning. And I think if we look at other kind of traditional expectations about a movement like that, pro-democracy, anti-authoritarian movement, we would expect, especially, of course, literature that writes about movements, social movements, often based on, unfortunately, only Western perspective, because there's not much research been done, and it's going on. It's more difficult to study authoritarian countries, right, in general. So what literature that based on Western cases expect from movements like that, except for numbers, is unity, unity of participants, unity of leaders, and that's what we see as well. Movement is quite unified. We have, of course, different sets of leaders, but they seems to be quite in harmony, at least publicly. We have this set of symbolic leaders who are mostly now abroad or in prisons, and including Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Latushka, and others. And we have a bunch of sort of everyday coordinators who are not as visible, but nevertheless very important, who coordinate process on the everyday basis. They're both inside the country and outside. What else is expected from the movement like that? We expect commitment of participants. We expect that people would, in fact, risk something to participate. And people do risk, especially the first couple of days, first couple of weeks as well. And every day, essentially, every day you go on the street and you're risking your freedom, your health, your job, and it's been happening. It's also kind of happening as well. Finally, many would expect kind of representation, that would movement represent different parts of society. It would be joined not just, say, by sort of urban elite, but also by other type of participants. And it's been happening as well. There were defectors from the police, as I mentioned, and other types of kind of state-related institutions, and as well as, of course, all types of classes, ages, and also all types of people join. So in that respect, kind of movement should win. At least it looks very good, but in my opinion, the kind of this benchmarking view on that is based mostly on kind of assessment of this external sort of results is not exactly what might answer the question, what might happen to the Belarusian movement next. And for that reason, I suggest looking at other things. And I suggest looking at something called capacity approach. So the question would be, what types of capacities movement needs to win in Belarus? And for instance, based on writing by Zinab Tufekci, who is in fact professor at the UNC, she suggests looking at three types of kind of factors that might help us to understand how movement, what was its chances, and what will these chances be in the future. And she suggests looking at narratives, first narratives, then ability to disrupt something, and its institutional capacity. And in terms of narratives, the first kind of factor that is important in that respect, I think Belarusian movement, again, is winning. It's been able to change narrative about government protest, and it seems to be that movement's view of society and the future of Belarus has been accepted widely in society. The second thing, its ability to disrupt kind of everyday life. And that's what a key thing, I think. That's what movement lacks at the moment. I think it's of course, very intriguing to see huge numbers of people on the streets. But what I think what was most dangerous element of the protest development over the last 2 months for the government was strikes, and this ability to introduce striking elements and introduce worker strikes in Belarus that is at the beginning looked like possible. Nowadays doesn't look as much possible as it used to be. I think this what I would call disruptive capacity for this movement. It doesn't really present at the moment. It's not present, and it means we might not see much kind of success if it doesn't come. So I think that's what we should look at. We should look at its ability to disrupt government operations, and obviously, as the Belarusian government relies very much on state-owned enterprises, strikes at those enterprises might change the momentum for the movement. Finally, institutional capacity. So ability to change institutions within or from the outside. And by this, we mean all types of institutions that exist in society, but specifically those that provide repression. So they're the police, this other kind of military or powerful forces. And this was perhaps the weakest point so far as well. It doesn't look like the movement, maybe we can discuss it, but comparatively doesn't look like there is much kind of institutional visible traction within the government, except maybe for Minister of Foreign Affairs that experienced kind of mass defection of supporters of the movement who left, in fact, didn't stay inside, so they also lost their ability to influence. So with that kind of conclusion, I suggest that we need really to think about those three capacities I mentioned, and specifically focus on disruptive ability of Belarusian movements and institutional capacity. And if the movement is able to enhance capacities within those areas, we might see some serious changes in the political system of Belarus in the coming months. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those provocative, I think, remarks. Hanna,
Sure, hello, hi. Thank you for having me. So I'm a journalist and I'm telling stories. And let me tell you a story of how in only 74 days, the Belarusian people were able to basically change the way of how the world perceives Belarus. The country has been grabbing the world's attention as citizens took to the streets, and they denied the obviously rigged election results. Protests happened before in Belarus, but why is this time different? Well, firstly, during the first 3 days after the election on the 9th of August, nearly 7,000 people were arrested. Many of those who were arrested were beaten and tortured in detention centers by prison guards and riot police officers. And well, violence happened before, but this level was just too immense. And I remember people were just, walking on the streets. They didn't have internet, and they were discussing what happened. And it seemed that everybody knew someone who was affected by the detention. Like someone's friend was detained, someone's friend was beaten, was tortured, and they were basically discussing it. Oh, I know this girl. She just went out, and she was just grabbed to unmarked buses. So when I was on the streets of Minsk during these first 3 days, basically the darkest, I guess, days in the history, in the modern history of Belarus, during the day, it was like an ordinary day. Basically, people were running to do their own business, but in the evening and at night, when the internet disappeared, it all looked like an unannounced curfew. Basically, main roads, main streets were blocked. There was no internet, and people were just, roaming the city center. They were not allowed to go like this way, and they had to kind of change their way. And I remember, why was everyone affected? Because you kind of didn't know even where to go. There were moments when I remember these protests were taking place in different spots in the city, and they were obviously peaceful. It was even during kind of the daytime, right? It was not even dark. And all of a sudden, special forces would arrive and they would deploy stun grenades, tear gas, not only against the protesters, but also against kind of those people who were just coming back home. I remember stun grenades exploding just near a bus stop where people were staying, and people just, you know, began crying because it was so scary. So it only showed that basically, you know, to people that, you know, it wasn't possible that Lukashenko would win 80% of the votes. So this level of brutality, instead of getting people, making people scared, unified them. And now I would say that people are not only fighting against Lukashenko. Obviously, it's they just want him to go. They want to change the man at the top. But first of all, that's an uprising. That's a revolution of dignity, and people just are demanding justice. They just want their kind of human rights be respected. And what is happening from the side of the authorities, they are just alienating themselves from the people to that extent that Lukashenko awarded riot police officers instead of punishing them. So it's only making people angrier and angrier. And like just to kind of give you also some bits of the atmosphere on the streets, you know, during this kind of darkest days, you might remember this news about drones that were bought by the European Union and delivered to the Belarusian police. So I was basically followed by one of those drones, and you know, so that was kind of happening, and we journalists. We had to flee, we had to run from Amman. We you know, had this joke that, oh, are you fine? Are you okay? Yes, because I can run fast. And I'm a journalist, right? I'm kind of used to it, but imagine ordinary citizens who all of a sudden found themselves in a situation of basically an open conflict, something like a war. And yes, again, so it affected everyone. And that's now a clear division between the authorities and the people. And it's no longer an anti-Lukashenko uprising, but just kind of resistance to violence united the nation. So who is on the streets? Well, basically everyone, women, students, the middle class, which is very interesting, people with disabilities, pensioners, like basically I cannot name a single social group that supports Lukashenko now. What I believe, however, is important to mention is that I think it has been also missing is that this uprising, this mobilization started months before the election. It started even before the election campaign in May. You might remember that Lukashenko said that vodka, tractors, and sauna are the cure for the pandemic, for the coronavirus. And at that moment, basically lacking any support from the government, Belarusians self-organized to deliver masks and protective equipment. They collected like hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they've basically covered nearly every hospital in Belarus. So all of a sudden, people understood their power, that they were able to manage the pandemic themselves. They didn't really need the government for this. And it was kind of one of the, I guess, last straws for many people. Obviously, lies of Lukashenko and his state media, his disrespectful attitude, but also this kind of understanding that they are united. You know, this kind of major threat of the pandemic, threat to their health and lives, basically united them. While so this trust in media, while trust in Lukashenko and in state media decreased immensely because they were lying, and people saw that, you know, people like are dying on the, you know, in hospitals, and they saw that there is a difference between the official statistics and what they've been experiencing. So this trust decreased, while trust in independent media, bloggers and social media increased immensely. And that's why we're seeing now this kind of incredible trust in Telegram channels who basically are coordinating the protests at the moment. And you might know that, you know, these Telegram channels are basically anonymous, and people just don't know who kind of manages, these channels. Nevertheless, they trust them to that extent that they would follow kind of this route, and they would gather at these places where, the Telegram channels told them to gather. So it's kind of interesting, this immense, trust. The nation got politicized and mobilized also because of this general tiredness of Lukashenko, who has been in power for 26 years. And then new faces in politics appeared. Women led by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Maria Kolesnikova, Veronika Tsapkava, this female trio unified the country. I was traveling across Belarus before the election, and I attended basically Tikhanovskaya's and the female trio's rallies all over the country. I've been to those, cities and towns where rallies never happened before. And while Lukashenko dismissed Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as a poor thing that would collapse, people did not. And people would tell me that, well, she is empathetic, she's kind, she's listening to us. And while Lukashenko was not able of ruling the country, she might be able to do so. Like, how come that, he is kind of implying that she as a woman would not able to become president. So I would say that for all of these reasons, also this economic instability, this kind of stagnation, this economic crisis that has been happening in the past years, for all these reasons, this time is different. And if you ask, and Volha kind of mentioned that, if you ask whether these protests would stop, I'd say no, because this discontent has been brewing for years. And there is a whole list of reasons for people to kind of to protest and to be active. And I'll just mention this kind of wave, wave of solidarity, wave of self-organization. When Aliaksandr was talking about this institutionalization of the protest, I think it's important also to kind of observe, to see what has been happening on the local level and how people are now self-organizing at these local neighborhoods. They are so united that they organize these concerts and so on. But that's, I think, a basis for self-governance in the future. Solidarity is also incredible among the people. Basically, Belarusians are so united at the moment, they just help each other. And it's very interesting to observe this in a country where kind of this lack of trust between people was very high, because of the Soviet Union, because of so many reasons. And now it's completely different. There was even this sociological research that said that people trust their neighbors now more than basically any state institution. So, well, I would say, I guess, to conclude that the society has evolved immensely. And before the election, when I traveled, and I see this kind of incredible level of politicization among people when they were so interested in politics, when they were they were quoting the constitution, the GDP of Sweden, comparing it to the country's GDP, right? And saying that, well, we have to reform the economy. We have to kind of change Lukashenko and introduce some, kind of changes in legislation and so on. So I would say that also incredibly, people were so interested in basically free and fair election. I'd say that what kind of makes me optimistic is that this uprising is not about some, I don't know, low salaries, right? It's about human dignity. It's about human rights. So that's dimension is incredibly important. And I guess, well, this kind of widespread grassroots movement, it won't be possible to stop just like that, because, well, people feel so much disgust towards Lukashenko. And even if this wave of protest finishes, I'd say that another wave would come with the next year, or whenever this wave would stop, because of the economic crisis, because of the financial crisis, and for those kind of many reasons I already mentioned.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. At the risk of editorializing, a risk I'm going to take, what I'm hearing is a general agreement that there's no going back. That the country has transformed. The past is the past, and the frustration now is trying to work out where the future comes from. And one of the things I loved about your presentation, Hanna, was to and Aliaksandr and Volha, is we're starting to see some of the contours of where that future might come from, and in community organizing and collective changes in consciousness. And so that's all very all very heartening and exciting. Let's move now to kind of like zoom out a little bit and look at the broader context, which many observers have thought for a long time is going to be important. It usually is in this part of Europe. And so let's turn to Arkady. And are you there? Excellent. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Arkady.
Thank you very much, Graeme, for inviting me, and thank you for your introduction. Yes, I was asked to talk about Russia tonight. And I think I'm going to present a kind of paradoxical point of view. I believe that having saved Lukashenko, having preferred Lukashenko's incumbency to a possibility to reset relations with Belarus, Kremlin has put itself into a corner, because it is not creating any new, more advantageous situation for itself. It is just going back to the times, or to dilemmas rather, which it has not been able to solve for 20 years. The first point which I'm going to make is simple and clear and not controversial, is that yes, I believe that it was Russia who saved Lukashenko. And not only because it provided and keeps providing the regime with diplomatic, informational, economic resources, potentially police force, but because of another much more important thing, because of a signal which it sent to Belarusian elites that it will stick and stand by Lukashenko. Had it abstained, I'm sure that the elites would be split by now, and then the rate of defection would have been much higher. But it basically said that whatever happens, it sticks to Lukashenko. And this is the signal which the Belarusian, the pro-regime elites have read and received and acted in accordance with that signal. So then the question is, why did it do so? And why does it do so every time, in 2006, in 2010, and now? And there are two sets of explanations from my point of view. Both are very important, but I'll start with the one which I like more, because that's the argument which I have been making for years. And that's the argument thanks to which, or due to which, I've been in the minority among the analysts in the last 5 years. And the argument is that Russia is actually quite comfortable to have Lukashenko in Belarus. Yes, he is not ideal. He may frustrate Russian leaders every once in a while, but basically he does what Russia wants him to do. And I'll mention three things here. One, he denies Belarus to the West, because for as long as he stays in power, there will be no trust-based relationship between Minsk and Western countries, Western institutions. There will always be a muscle memory of previous rounds of sanctions and difficulties and complications and whatnot. And he is not willing to take Belarus to the West, and that's what matters. Second, for as long as he stays in power, there will be no reforms in Belarus. And that means that Belarus will forever remain dependent on Russian subsidies. It will not be resilient in the face of Russian pressure, because it needs Russia more than Russia needs Minsk's support. And that's what matters. And three, just because he is a like-minded autocrat. You don't have to like what he's doing, but you understand what he's doing. You know his instincts. He's a well-known evil, but I would not use even that word. It's just that he's a partner with whom Russia feels comfortable to engage. So why to change him for somebody else? And of course, the other set of reasons is linked with the fact that from Kremlin points of view, people should not have the right to decide who will rule them. I mean, elections is not the mechanism to choose the rulers, and certainly the protests is not the mechanism to show that certain decisions and political choices made by the incumbent leaders are right. So Russia likes Lukashenko and it dislikes fair and free elections and protests. So these two sets of reasons are enough to understand why it behaves the way it behaves. But then a more interesting question arises. What does the future hold? And this is where I'm arguing Russia is at a loss. Because even theoretically, it's now difficult to imagine that it can think of replacing Lukashenko. Because replacing Lukashenko, even if it were possible, I'm not sure it is possible, but even if it were possible, it would be a huge risk. Because imagine there is now somebody else at the head of a similar type of regime. Is it possible? Not necessarily, because the current regime is handpicked. People who are running the show in Belarus now are loyal personally to Mr. Lukashenko. And I mean, they serve him. If you replace him with somebody else, infighting will start. There will be clans, there will be groups, there will be intra-elite strife, and sooner or later they will lose control over the situation. So it's a very risky choice to continue dealing with Belarus based on the same premises, but having somebody else there instead of Lukashenko. And after the protests, it just has become more difficult, because one point which we need to remember is that Russia has never had enough, let's say, openly pro-Russian forces in Belarus. Now it's basically impossible. Belarusian elites will tread very carefully before they decide to play along with Russia. Look at the events of the last days. Mr. Shklarov was released because we know Mr. Pompeo has been personally saying that that had to be done. Now think about the people like Babarika, like Tikhanovsky, whom, okay, we don't know the truth, but whom the analytical community at least believes that these people were playing, let's say, a role that Russia might have written for them. These people are still in jail. So if you are somebody, if you are a high-level Belarusian bureaucrat thinking whether or not to join Russia in its effort, you will think twice or thrice, because it's very personally unsafe to play along with Russia. Russia cannot get these people out of jail, unlike the United States. And this is something very important. But more importantly, if Lukashenko goes, whatever will be the real reason, he will go after the protests, and many people will believe it will happen or have happened as a result of the protests. That will bring political competition and politics back to Belarus. So every next leader will be thinking about potential protests, will be thinking about how to please local public opinion, local population, local elites, if necessary, at the expense of Moscow's wishes. So you're basically creating a problem for yourself by getting rid of Lukashenko. So you're going to have Lukashenko, but this is not the end, because now some people say, oh, finally Russia got what it wanted because Lukashenko is weak. I'm not sure he's actually weak, but you cannot instrumentalize that weakness too much, because imagine he behaves as a weak president is supposed to behave, like allowing Russia to have new military bases on the territory of Belarus, signing agreements which would border on the loss of Belarusian sovereignty, agreeing to transfer control over the economic assets in Belarus towards the Russian companies and so on. What will we get? We will get just a new uprising very soon, which will nullify all his concessions and all Russia's gains, right? So basically you don't do it. You don't pressurize him too much. And if there is a strong Lukashenko, at least stronger than now, we're just back to square one. He will not deliver upon his promises, will be happy to enjoy the money and the subsidies, but not giving anything in return. maybe Russia would be able to pay him less than it has been paying before, but even that is not guaranteed because he will be need to keep his power base satisfied, which is only possible if Russian money keeps coming. So you cannot instrumentalize his weakness too much, and you cannot count on his strengths. That's even less possible. So we would need to think about a totally fantastic scenario that basically Lukashenko replaces himself. He chooses a successor. He makes sure that this guy will be more to Russia's liking and still able to control the vertical of power, which is something I believe is really a non-science fiction. So I think Russia has really got into trouble, and it has got into trouble because the time is running out. Because strategically, and I agree with the previous speakers, this regime is on its way out. It might take time. It's not necessarily going to happen in the coming weeks, but it's going to happen in the coming years. And the next revolution in Belarus can be geopolitical, it can be national democratic, and it can be one which will put also the future of Russian-Belarusian relations into much more problematic position than it looks now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. And then to finish up from the panel side, I'm delighted to turn now to Gwen.
Thanks, Graeme, and also thank you for inviting me to discuss with you. You assigned the role to me to talk about the EU and Germany, probably because I'm based in Berlin. But if I may, I'd like to just in a bullet point kind of fashion highlight a few things I find truly remarkable, and we need to keep making these points because I fear that despite the regular coverage of the events, and Hanna mentioned Belarus has really grabbed world attention, I think we're at a moment where any event that lasts a long time, it becomes a strange sense of normality around seeing these pictures. And I think one needs to sort of highlight and keep it in the center of attention, even though we see the images around us. And I think it's truly remarkable also for those of us who study protests, that this is a protest, a mass mobilization lasting for already 11 weeks. We've heard already about the key triggers and so on. Despite violent repression, or maybe because of violent repression, it turns so quickly into mass mobilization of a cross-section of society, and that's going on. It's remarkable, it's still peaceful despite all the violent repression. It is remarkable, as previous speakers have said, because we see so much bottom-up self-organization and also such a high degree of creativity to constantly try and wrong foot those out there to repress the protests. And this decentralized nature of the mobilization, I think, is very important. So I think I agree with previous speakers that the legitimacy of the regime is gone. So I think it's a matter of time when change happens now in terms of an institutional reform process and how this will come about. But I think it's still highly uncertain if and when more elites tied closely to the security apparatus might jump ship. And I think it is also unclear at which point the strength of the mass mobilization, of not having centralized structures, becomes a liability. And I think we might be at this point where, on the one hand, the strength of decentralized organizing from the bottom up turns into a liability and cannot push. And I think that's what Aliaksandr was talking about in terms of capacities, the effect of the protests further. I agree, I think, with most of what, turning a bit to the international dimension that I was mostly meant to comment on. I agree with most of what Arkady said about Russia, and then I come to the EU in a moment. But I think it's also remarkable that Russia has been, I think, quite cautious and quite hesitant. And I think it reflects that maybe something that I didn't hear Arkady say now. I mean, this is clearly tied to Putin's self-interest. No? So a lot depends also on what happens inside Russia, how much one can afford having these events go on for too long, but also holding on to Lukashenko, who has lost regime legitimacy, can now also be a liability at some point, I think, for Putin. So I wouldn't exclude the possibility that basically Arkady's scenario, that Lukashenko himself is involved in finding a successor or moving some sort of a negotiated process that way. I wouldn't exclude that Putin might give the signal to do this. And I think Lukashenko is entirely dependent on what Putin tells him to do if he decides to do so. So I wouldn't say that there isn't a possibility for Putin still to drop Lukashenko, but maybe in that seemingly softer way, and find a replacement that maintains links with Russia, but on a different footing. And I'm not saying it's the same thing, but in Armenia, a different kind of balance was managed, and Putin also did not hang on, and the Kremlin did not hang on to one particular candidate. It's just highly unclear who that candidate might be. So coming to the EU, well, I used the word remarkable many times. It's not remarkable. It's a typical hesitant response of the EU, and it shows that this whole development in Belarus is a test for the EU at several levels. On the one hand, it's I think clear to everybody on this call, but I find not when I talk to German or international media, there are clear differences from the outset in Belarus and in Ukraine. So where the EU was much more present on the ground and had already at different levels built all kinds of links with the EU. So the EU doesn't have that presence on the ground in Belarus. So it was from the outside limited in what it could do. Having said that, it did what it tends to do in situations like this. It declared the elections not only irregular, it didn't recognize Lukashenko as the elected president, and it agreed in principle on sanctions, found 40 people tied to electoral manipulation and repressions, put them on the list, and then a typical EU mechanism kicked in. Cyprus vetoed those sanctions and wanted to address, first of all, its own conflict with Turkey over gas explorations off the coast of Cyprus. So that delayed and cost a lot of time. It's maybe not for those of us dealing with the EU or studying the EU, if you want to build sanction regimes on consensus, which doesn't have to be strictly speaking the case, but the EU prefers it that way, also for understandable reasons, and it's obviously a stronger message. Then things that are completely not related to the current situation in Belarus can intervene, and this at least symbolic statement that personal sanctions are mostly about travel bans and asset freezes, so their effect directly on the ground is limited, but of course they carry symbolic weight. So then in early October, it became possible to enact these sanctions after Cyprus dropped its veto. And currently new discussions are underway to extend the number of, or to increase the number of individuals on that list, and also to put Lukashenko on that list, which the EU, based on its consensus rule, had not done initially. Individual EU member states have done so. The Baltic states, in particular Lithuania, has gone much further. There's already over 100 people on the list of sanctions, Lukashenko among them. And now the EU has, as far as I can see, also turned to planning, which is a typical, I think, instinct of the EU, and maybe also what it does best, but it seems a little premature. It's discussing economic support packages for the future. It is discussing all important things, but they might send a certain signal, but they will not, in my view, affect the situation on the ground, talking about more visa liberalization. Obviously, humanitarian medical aid is something more directly targeted now, but those kinds of measures are more medium-term or long-term measures. They will all be needed, and it's good that somebody's talking about them, but they, I think, are unlikely to affect the balance on the ground. And the dilemma the EU has faced from the beginning, not only not being present really in Belarus, but also that there was a fear that anything that would be said by any EU member states or the EU or done would be classified as that provocation that Russia would take as a basis for intervening more. The EU has hoped and is still hoping for the OSCE to become a mediator in this situation. But the OSCE itself, although it would in principle be a good institution for this, as both Russia and Belarus are also represented in it, but it's institutionally weak at the moment and lacks its entire institutional leadership. So it's also been outright rejected by Lukashenko, but there's still kind of hope that if it moves towards some sort of a negotiation, that the OSCE might play a part. Germany has a kind of maybe highly visible role, partly because it holds the EU presidency at the moment, partly in parts also because it is one of few EU member states that has regular, at least phone conversations with Putin. They don't ever, I think, generate very much, but there is a direct sort of back channel. And I think this is a situation where, in addition to EU policy in terms of sending a signal, this bilateral diplomacy is important. And if anything can sort of help make Putin push Lukashenko into some sort of a transition mode, then that is an element that will be important, and it's going on, but it hasn't worked so far. If I may just briefly say or conclude with one thing from a project I'm engaged with. I see Ola Onuch from the University of Manchester in the call as well. Through a project we're involved in, Mobilize, we are conducting an ongoing survey of protesters in Belarus. We started in August, shortly after the elections. It's still running. It's become a bit of a monster project because by now 30,000 people have participated. And we still haven't managed to analyze it in detail. But one thing that is apparent from that, without me being able to now say exactly at which point possibly views or perceptions changed, it is telling that it's, if we ask people what they hope for, what they expect to happen, and previous speakers have mentioned it too, it's really no longer only about new elections as the initial demand was. It's clearly about Lukashenko has to go, whatever that means, however that will be achieved, more general changes, democracy, and very few, a tiny number of people mentions that it is about relations with the EU or relations with Russia. So that has not changed. So these are figures as low as sort of 1 or 2% in both cases if people pick one priority. But if we ask people to agree or disagree with certain statements about closer links with the EU, we see a mixed picture. And here I can't say if this is, my hunch would be that this is increasingly perhaps more relevant or maybe more polarized, at about 40% want closer links and about 40% do not. And if you ask about the Russian Union, the Union state with Russia, very clear negative answer. So that's over 70% not wanting that. That's a very clear verdict. And then again, an unclear position on whether Russia constitutes a threat for Belarus. And there again, about 38% think so and don't think so. So it makes me wonder if through the dynamics of the domestic dynamics of the protest, that this international dimension, which all the participants always emphasize isn't there, and international actors, at least on the Western side, were keen to avoid, is actually becoming increasingly an element of this development. And I leave it there.
Okay, wonderful. Just 30,000 respondents so far. So not much data there. So there are tons of questions, and I've been making a list and I've been trying to group them, but I want to just start with really the building off Gwen's final comments and a provocative question that Alexander put in the chat, which was essentially, is this a geopolitical revolution that we're seeing in Belarus? On the one hand, Gwen's data says no, and on the other hand, Gwen's data says yes, right? So there's not a clear pro-EU, anti-Russia dimension here, and yet there's a clear pro-democracy and dignity dimension. And in other places where we've seen revolutions, those have really coincided very closely. And so I wonder to what extent that those are separable, to what extent this can remain defined in a unifying all Belarusian context without these other quite important divisions coming forward. And then this is to all of you, and especially to Arkady, how does Russia see this? Does Russia see this as a geopolitical revolution, or does it see those things as separable the way they were in Armenia?
I guess Russia sees it as a potentially geopolitical revolution. That's exactly where the problems start, because they suspect the West is behind. They are looking for conspiracies. Of course, they see that there are no EU flags, which were there 10 years ago. They see that the EU is somewhat reluctant and very slow to act. But at least the official rhetoric which Lukashenko spreads is echoed now in Russia. If you look at what the official commentators are saying, they basically refuse to accept that this is not a geopolitical revolution.
Do we have some other voices on this one? Thank you, Arkady.
Well, I have a 5-cent point. I mean, I don't see it as a geopolitical revolution, and I also see increasingly events in the region will not be seen as a geopolitical revolution, because in part, I mean, by the people in the country themselves, not so much by external actors. And that's because, you know, early on, there was this, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was this kind of choice between the democratic West and the past, the Soviet past associated with the East, with all the undemocratic regimes and so on. Now things are very complicated in the East and in the West, and there are no divisions in Belarus between alliance on the East and the West. And the EU is no longer actively trying to impose any kind of conditionality, as it did before on countries that were considering joining the EU, which probably encouraged other countries in Eastern neighborhood, as well as on countries that were part of Eastern Partnership. So that politics is gone. And so I think partly as a result of that, these values of having some kind of election and choice and political voice and the West are no longer as closely tied, at least in the minds of the population, which is all I think for the better, because it triggers less anxiety in Russia. It's more consistent with what the population thinks. For example, there are all these questionnaires about symbols, a red and white flag and white, red, white flag. And while right now the protesters are all carrying white, red, white flag, overall looking at the survey suggests that the population, even the anti-Lukashenko groups, are not necessarily, you know, speaking Belarusian, supporting only white, red, white flag, or you know, and are in that camp. And I think it's actually a good thing, because that is not a geopolitical revolution, and I don't see it happening in the future just because of where Belarus is, its economic ties in Russia, and EU's lack of interest to take on this huge responsibility to the West.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Gwen, you had your finger up.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly come in again and just say what I meant was that it's becoming more important. I don't think it has to be and will necessarily be some geopolitical standoff, but just because of the values, the demands now, that they are associated not with the EU as an institution necessarily, but with values like democracy, human rights, Hanna mentioned dignity. So I think there's sort of by default, this enters, even though political actors inside and outside of Belarus have been quite careful not to put it in this sort of East-West standoff. But I think it's almost by default, through this emphasis on values you associate with at least countries located in the EU, if not with the EU as a whole, that is important. And I see a question from Rosa in the chat, and just to clarify what I meant, I don't think at all that Belarusian people need to drop cooperation with Russia to please the EU. I mean, we have an example in Armenia where the EU actually showed that it can also learn and be open to a relationship that, for example, has economic linkages both to the EU and to Russia. So I didn't mean to say that. I meant more that through some EU member states with links and diplomatic channels to Moscow, that signal could come for Lukashenko to basically negotiate his own, maybe safe, but negotiate his exit. So I didn't mean at all that it's an interest to keep Lukashenko in power. So in case that was misunderstood. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else on that one? If not, then I want to switch to two different batches of questions that I've gotten. One focusing on the sort of the structure and sociology of the opposition, and then one focusing on the structure and sociology of the security forces and those backing Lukashenko. We have a question from Sam, who's just recently conducted a survey in Belarus, and one of the findings of Sam's survey is that the sort of the youngest age group, the kind of 18 to 24 age group, seems surprisingly turned off from politics and independent media, whereas it's you know, a slightly older demographic, the 25 to 35 demographic that's more engaged, and then people over 55. And so one of the questions is that, does that chime, Hanna, for example, with your feeling on the ground that there is this sort of different contours across ages amongst the protesters and amongst the opponents, or is it, do you see it as much more unified across generations?
Well, I mean, different generations are protesting, right? And I think it's been kind of visible, especially, well, what's interesting, I think, is that different kind of professional groups, age groups, or some social groups are kind of organizing their own rallies. Today, there were rallies of students who have been protesting basically every day since September. That's an incredibly kind of important movement because, well, those universities are state funded, and these, you know, youngsters are, well, they're threatened. Some of them have been expelled. They've been jailed. Today, we've also seen a protest of people with disabilities. On Monday, there were protests of pensioners, like those people, those kind of the elderly people. Women have been protesting, as you know. IT people have been protesting. They've been organizing their own kind of, you know, rallies in support of this IT company where kind of employees were jailed. PandaDoc, it's called. It's a US-based company. So I'd say that firstly, kind of people are united, obviously, across the country, but also these kind of social groups, professional age groups are also united. And speaking of trust that they already mentioned, and speaking of this kind of self-organization, this would bring kind of this, you know, professional unions or some other kind of types of self-organization in the future. And that's, again, I mean, that's crucial, that's important, because that's kind of this, you know, kind of self-governance, right? Which would be important in the future, because we've been associated Belarus with this, you know, paternalistic culture. And I think people are kind of going away from the societies, kind of going away from this. So coming back to this age, you know, how to say, kind of age of the protesters. Well, it's completely different. Obviously, whenever these protests are like in the evening, late at night, when there was, you know, violence and then people had to run, these were youngsters, right? But otherwise, these are absolutely kind of, you know, people from all walks of life, I would say.
Gwen?
Yeah, it would be interesting, Sam, to compare our figures. At ZOiS, we conducted in the last few years already surveys among Belarusian youth. And we also did it early this year and then in June again this year. And the age group was up to 34. And we found that that the group you highlight, the older part of that segment, was more engaged, but we did not find, I mean, it was even more engaged, and already before the elections, we saw this enormous drop in trust in institutions, a willingness to come out and vote. So, and use of social media, of course, always a bit unclear what social media are used for. even if you asked for a source of information. So it surprises me a little, while kind of the slightly older segment seemed more engaged. It would mean that something seems to have changed, which is a bit counterintuitive after what we've seen. But that would be interesting to look at in more detail.
Yeah, could I, we also have a number of questions that focus around different aspects of the strategy of the opposition. And so Hanna specifically mentioned Telegram and the role of Telegram. And I know Aliaksandr has done work on this area. So there are a couple of questions here. One is this extraordinary trust that people show to anonymous messages or unverifiable sources, I think is really striking, especially in a highly dangerous situation. And I wonder if you could say something more about that. And then we had a question about foreign influence through Nexta, which has been one of the main sources of information for ordinary Belarusians around this in this crisis time, is based in Poland for fairly obvious reasons. And does this reflect foreign influence, or is this a purely independent, autonomous Belarusian phenomenon?
All right, yeah, I will start perhaps with regarding foreign influence. Clearly, it's not only people who are in Poland influence everyday strategy and actions and tactics of the movement. Clearly, those people play an important role in coordinating everyday action, but they're not the only people who decide and direct and inform participants of the movement. There are many hundreds of people inside the country who play similar important role of informing, mobilizing, coordinating. Those people are inside the country, and those people who are outside, most of them perhaps were forced to leave the country for political reasons, and they publicly say that they dream of returning, and they clearly, I don't believe they anyhow significantly influenced by any foreign state. But obviously there is an attempt to influence by by Russia through its traditional media sources, such as television, such as internet, perhaps as well. There's quite enough evidence to suggest that Russia been developing and staging disinformation campaign, at least on television, Russian state television, about the Belarusian process to support the current government in Belarus. And this is a clear example of attempt to influence. Regarding Telegram and trust, indeed, it's an interesting phenomenon. Why do people trust anonymous administrators of multiple Telegram channels and chats that try to coordinate and also spread information? Well, clearly, there are many layers to this issue, and it seems like at the moment, it seems like most of the coordination happen in very local small communities where people interact between each other, but also they are related to larger communities. So I think this question is this question of building trust that's been built by larger communities, by administrators of prominent Telegram channels and groups over time, and then now it's sort of this trust been transformed on the more kind of local ground, and essentially it looks like, of course, there are a lot of issues related to possible sort of people aware that that there is also police present in those groups they follow, and but it seems like this dynamics of digital media, of this particular type of platform, messaging platform, really influences how people perceive information there. And it seems like that they kind of decide on their own to trust or not dynamically. So it's sort of a dynamic process. It's not always that they follow what, say, Nechta or another Telegram channel says. They also make decisions themselves, at least locally. That's what perhaps I will be trying to demonstrate and prove in coming weeks in my research. But I can't really show you definite evidence for that. And regarding last question, just Sam's question, he mentioned that 18 to 24 people were less engaged. Actually, interestingly, Telegram channel of one of the major traditional, or used to be traditional, independent media called Nasha Niva, which is Belarusian speaking, one of few Belarusian speaking prominent media sources, did a poll last week, I think, asking who are you people who are reading us, and they have more than 100,000 subscribers on their Telegram, and in fact, at least it seemed to be that the least engaged part of the population was exactly this group of younger people. So it seems to be that those most young people, they're getting their news elsewhere, not from the Telegram traditional sources, but rather it could be either groups, chats, non-traditional media, or YouTube.
Great, thank you. So I have a lot of questions. I'm going to start squishing some of them together. There's a sort of nexus of issues that were raised about disruption. So this Aliaksandr kicked us off with the idea of disruption and the capacity for disruption. We've had a few questions about the capacity for the coordinating council to actually organize disruption, and to what extent do we see that as possible? To what extent do we see the planned, national strike? Is that one-day national strike? Is that going to make a difference, or is this going to be seen as just the first of what will be an indefinite national strike? What do we think the odds are of people working in large enterprises actually joining this strike? And then I guess finally the last question related to that would be around the degree of unity within the coordinating council. I don't know if anyone has insight into that, but how unified are the opposition around this, these kind of really tough tactical and strategic decisions that are going to have to be made in the coming weeks?
All right, perhaps I say a few words about strikes, and I think it seems to me that even one day of national strike that would be really sort of big scale, that would make huge difference. But it doesn't look like at least publicly, Tikhanovskaya and her team, for instance, do not acknowledge that they do much work in that direction. Maybe it's been happening privately, but at least I think in most recent interviews she said that she just sort of called for strike and she believes people would self-organize. But I think it's not the best way to perform this type of actions. I think there should be organizational work done elsewhere, and it should be also coordinated very carefully. Though, of course, in the team of Tikhanovskaya, people around her, there are very experienced people, representative of trade unions, who've been playing important part in previous wave of protest 2017 in Belarus, who were very instrumental to this protest, and they're very experienced, and I think they perhaps play a role in organizing these events right now, though I'm not sure.
Hanna, Volha?
Yeah, perhaps I've unmuted myself. Well, I would add regarding strikes that a lot of work has been done, by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her team actually to organize the strike. It's not that easy though. You have workers who are, quite, well, they don't earn a lot. And for many, for many workers, let's say at this, enterprise Belarus, right? This kind of the only job opportunities they might have. This is a very specific job. They are minors, and that's kind of the only place where they basically can work. But nevertheless, I can say, and I do have some insights. Well, there are kind of what's actually was publicly mentioned is that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya talks to those different groups, to workers at Belarus, at Grodno Azot, and some other enterprises. And I can name at least 8 enterprises, at least 8 plants that are ready to announce a strike. It's not obviously possible to say at this stage whether this would happen, but I can see that there are, well, dozens, if not thousands of people, workers who are ready to do so, to strike, to go and strike. It all depends also on the work that funds are doing, because, well, most recently, these solidarity funds, these crowdfunding initiatives, they've paid 1 million euros to workers and those affected by political repressions. They were either fired or, there are different ways of kind of how the authorities are not paying them. So, there should be a lot of work, obviously, and the ultimatum was announced 2 weeks ago, and it's not enough time. And I can say that, well, perhaps on Monday, only, as many actually as 8, if at least 8 enterprises would go on strike, that would be a success. And this work would continue. So this is not kind of the end of it, right? And that's only the beginning. But let's remember how actually the several plans, when they announced strikes, when workers went on strike, how it scared Alexander Lukashenko in August already, right? So that might be another kind of game changer for him. And just briefly regarding the Coordination Council and regarding kind of this, I don't have so many insights about that. Perhaps my colleagues have, but I'd say, well, there are a lot of people in the Coordination Council. I don't know how many they have now, but there are like, hundreds of people. That's a kind of a parliament, basically. There are so many members. And for many people in Belarus, it looks kind of obscure. They don't know what's happening and why this body was created. So I think there are kind of part of the Coordination Council is based in Poland because they were, jailed and released and they left. Another part is based in Belarus. So I know that those who are based, well, there are kind of regular calls between those two parts, and they kind of, communicate a lot. And I imagine that there is some trust between them, right? Since they are kind of in touch all the time. So yeah, so that's basically, I guess, what I can say about the Coordination Council. But what's more important, I guess, is how people perceive this body, and they basically are not quite aware of how it functions.
I'll just quickly add that I think, there are some silver linings in this. So certainly ultimatum was a good idea, but it's clear that neither the Lukashenko side would ever follow with all of those demands, or the strike would really be like all-encompassing and all-national. It's just very difficult. And even in the beginning, there were some strikes. They were never all-national, even immediately after elections. And then they were spreading after the fact. But I think it's actually good, what Hanna had mentioned, that the Coordination Council remains a little bit obscure, right? So Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is more like a symbol. People know her, but they view her as a symbol rather than leader of the protest movements, which means that there's already this momentum. And even though, let's say the promise of all national strike will not be actualized fully, it will not really undermine the credibility as a result of this Coordination Council not being the central body driving the protests anyway.
Great. So I'm gonna bundle a couple of questions around the timing of the revolution and the opposition to the revolution, and then we'll return to the panelists for our last go around the table for any concluding remarks they want to make. So the one question on timing is why now? Lukashenko has been in power since 1994. A lot of things have changed in all of that time, and we've had opposition support and repression. But what was so dramatically different this time? And then on the flip side of that is the question of the security forces and why are they hanging so tight, or apparently hanging so tight with the regime? What do we know about the kind of sociology of the security forces, especially the literal boots on the ground? Do we know anything about that? And what are the signs? Are there any signs of frictions and divisions on that side? And I'll turn that over to anybody who wants to address.
Well, I can probably try to answer the question why now. because it's time. About 15 months ago, I published a paper, co-authored a paper called Belarusian Paradox, a nation of today versus a president of the past. Those willing, you can find it and read more. I mean, we've identified a lot of trends within the society, which were like day after day sapping the support of Lukashenko because they were exposing him as a completely unmodern, anachronistic, unfit figure to lead the modern nation, because he is a complete obscurant. I mean, he wants to keep everything as it is. And as I said, I don't have time to go through the paper, but so we had the kind of the wave. We had protests 3 years ago, which were quite powerful, actually, the social economic protests. So it was not the complete calm. There were certain indicators, but also we should pay attention to several things that happened during this year and during the campaign in particular. Colossal mistakes. One was his attitude to the COVID pandemic, because people from his supporters and his electorate, they expected a typical behavior of a paternalistic state. They expected help in terms of money, in terms of medical treatment, and they got a totally dismissive attitude by the leader. We heard about that also today. That attitude ran against Belarusian cultural conventions, frankly. So this was quite explosive. And second thing, which I'll mention here, was his colossal mistake choosing Russia as an enemy during the campaign. Because his message that the Russians are kind of, he wanted to sell that message to the West. That's clear because it sells well in the West, but it does not sell in Belarus. Because in Belarus, you have two types of people. Some people believe that Russia is a brother, Russia is a friend, Russia will always help. And there was a cognitive dissonance. For 25 years, they've been hearing from the same Lukashenko that this is the best friend. And then he completely changed his rhetoric, and they didn't know, and that's his electorate, right? So they couldn't understand why and how Russia had become an enemy. But the other part of electorate, which actually believes that Russia is a problem, a security challenge for Belarus, for these people, Lukashenko is not a solution. He's part of the problem. So he should have been basically choosing a totally different central item on his agenda than Russia, like potentially undermining Belarusian sovereignty. Then, of course, the attitude to females, because he behaved in a way and spoke in a way which is completely unacceptable in a modern society. I mean, I could add things, but these are the three most important things. And then reliance on violence in August. I mean, violence was the only instrument which he had for the people. He obviously did not underestimate such a scale of protests. And he didn't understand that relying on naked violence would make his situation only worse. Thanks.
I just want to quickly jump in because I absolutely agree with what Arkady said, but I think one additional factor that also speaks to Lukashenko's anachronism and kind of losing a sense of touch after all these 26 years in power was uniting the opposition around a candidate that was unobjectionable to most people by repressing all the other candidates. So for the first time, this time, opposition was united around Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and in the past, there were always many candidates, and they were often imprisoned after the elections, not before. So he underestimated her as a woman, allowed her to register, which allowed her to hold rallies. And for many people, she was not objectionable because she didn't promote a specific kind of policy. She really could just say, I'm a political housewife. I just want a good future for my kids, and my husband is now in jail and I want him out. New elections. And that's something that all opposition could get behind regardless of their other disagreements. I see that as an important factor as well to channel common anti-Lukashenko settlement into one direction as opposed to many.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to highlight that point too. I think that's really important. The kind of candidates that stepped up, Tikhanovskaya, that made it kind of possible for lots of people to join in and to see, to associate something with her that wasn't there before. And I think related to COVID, what I think is important too is not not only the lack of trust, therefore, in the system and the social contract breaking, but also the need to organize already then locally, and in particular, not only, but in particular in the medical sector. And sort of this recent experience with that, I think, is probably a precursor also for self-organization now. And maybe the last thing we haven't mentioned yet, also the degree of electoral manipulation, I think, is an additional element. So I think it's an open question. If we would have seen all of this now, if we talk about the timing, no, the social contract would have broken and was broken, but with less blatant manipulation and of course the violence, I'm not sure if the same developments would have occurred right now.
Okay, well, we are, I promised our panelists I wouldn't torture them for more than 90 minutes. I mean, what I've learned today is many things about the situation in Belarus, but I think also some broader lessons for social scientists. And I think one of those lessons that we learned from Belarus, and we learned it in Ukraine, and we learned it, I think, also in Armenia, is never underestimate the people. That there's a tendency to stereotype and categorize, and to be stuck in the present. And the future can be amazingly different in ways that none of us foresee. Even if we see seeds growing here and there, the possibility of transformation and the power of revolution and popular participation in achieving social transformation is nothing short of staggering, and it blows me away every time I see it. And it's really been an amazing thing to see happening in Belarus. And then the second thing that I think I've learned is that some of the old problems remain, that organization remains really important and hard, and that leaderless movements and spontaneity is great, but for an end game, organization seems to remain to be really important, and you're having a strategy and developing a discipline strategy and approaches is critical, and we'll see over the next few weeks, I think, the extent to which that's been going on behind the scenes, and I hope it really has. Let me turn just to give our panelists one last chance. If there's anything that you will go around the table, if there's anything that you've been wanting to say that I've been cutting you off and stopping you from saying, that would be great. Volha, you want to?
Sure. I want to say I learned a lot from this panel, and I want to underscore your point about not underestimating the people. I think for me, especially important because I'm from Belarus, my family is there, but at the same time, I'm a political scientist and analyst. And so I know all about like Russia's influence and the importance of just Lukashenko is very entrenched. There has not been strong opposition as a result of that. I know all these factors, and it seems kind of like difficult to balance the fact that people in Belarus are united for change on the one hand, and that the success of their desire for change depends, among other things, on all of these other factors and external actors and so on. So it's been hard for me to analyze almost without any emotions. And so one quick thing I just wanted to say is that there was been a question about the structure of the security forces. And so, AMON or the Special Police Unit subordinated to the Ministry of Internal Affairs has been kind of the main unit involved in suppressing the protests. It's essentially riot police in Belarus. And so it's actually a pretty small unit, about 1,400 people. And so who are these people? As far as I understand, the main requirement is prior military service, secondary education. So there's no need for higher education for rank and file of AMON, physical fitness and absence of prior convictions. So what this means is in Belarus, there's draft for all men. However, most people are able, well, not most people, a lot of people are able to go to university and postpone that or do some kind of military service that does not involve serving in the army for a long period of time. So AMON are probably people who actually have done more serious military service for a number of reasons. they must have been healthy, and they probably did not start immediately their higher education. So I think important thing about the Mon to realize is that they all get subsidized housing, preferential loans, and they often live together in one place, which means there's tight camaraderie amongst this kind of people. So hopefully that's somewhat informative about who are these people involved. There's certainly other things like the army, the paratroopers, border guards, presidential security service, but they're somewhat less important in most protests.
That's great, thank you. Aliaksandr?
Yeah, thank you. Many great ideas been voiced today. Thank you for them. I don't have much to add. I think there's still many questions, and there are more questions than answers about current events in Belarus, clearly. We still don't know many things. In fact, we don't know. We know relatively little about people who participated, people who did not participate, what was the key motivation, and why now. Indeed, there are great theories voiced, but there could be others as well. And I think before answering that question, why now, we might think about the question like why Belarus was that unusually authoritarian state for so long. Why is that as well? Why it could preserve its status for so long? So this type of questions would be also helpful to address before explaining current movement, current protest in current revolution, maybe. And yeah, I'm looking forward to learning to next weeks and months, and perhaps, yeah, hopefully meeting each other again.
Thank you so much. I think we lost Hanna. She took the 90 minutes very seriously, perhaps. Arkady.
Yes, thank you. I will use this time to answer the question put by Anaïs Marin. And the question was basically about why Russia is not interested in the liberal economic reforms in Belarus. Wouldn't that be better for the business? And would the Russian people agree to keep subsidizing the regime forever? And I have several answers why, unfortunately, these kind of considerations are not particularly bothering the Kremlin at the moment. And one is that, of course, Russian people will not be asked. They're not asked about funding of Ukrainian war, Donbass, Syria, and so on. Second, if they were asked, actually, we don't know what the answer would be, but what we know from Levada polls, that sometimes the majority and practically always the plurality of Russians believe that Lukashenko has won the elections fair and free, that Lukashenko is a good president from the point of view of the Russian-Belarusian relations, and that what's going on in Belarus is a result of the Western conspiracy or the behavior of the protesters. So I think it would not be that difficult to convince quite a big chunk of the Russian people that this kind of funding would be needed. Three, it's not that much money. If we are now talking about $1.5 billion, this is just nothing. Even if it's like 5 times that, it's still very little. Russia has $600 billion of gold and currency reserves. And actually this year, these reserves have grown by 10%. So the Russian economic troubles should not be exaggerated. And finally, and most importantly, because Kremlin believes that it is involved into a geopolitical struggle, it's a war. And when you are at war with the West, or at least in a more or less systemic conflict, systemic from the point of view of Moscow's regime, then you should really fight. Kremlin cannot afford to lose Belarus, and keeping Lukashenko in power is obviously seen as a shorter way to make sure Belarus will not be lost for Russia than any other types. That's why when you put on the one part of the scales geopolitical interests, and on the other part of the scales you put money, the geopolitical interests win.
Thank you. Gwen?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think I take our discussion, but also everything we're observing in Belarus as a reminder to us as researchers to try even harder to study societal change in authoritarian regimes. I mean, I think some of us did try, but I think we were also in many ways surprised, and that also means we missed important things in a setting that is obviously difficult to maybe sometimes conduct empirical research in, but this is one of those cases. And then the other element would be what you mentioned, Graeme, as well. I mean, I'm struck by, and again, that's a challenge to us studying protest, how long and on what scale protests organized from below without clear institutional structures can be maintained. And then we had the open question, how much longer that's possible. But already sort of for this time period, that's already a challenge for us to understand.
Yeah, lots of work still to do. Well, I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists. I really did learn a tremendous amount, and I really appreciate your time and insights in the issue. I also want to thank our fabulous audience. We had at all times more than 80 people in the room, and we still have about 50 still with us at this stage, and for great questions and a very distinguished audience we've had today too. We're all braced for what comes next. I think there's a lot of uncertainty and about what comes next. But we're hoping for the best, and I hope that we'll all get together again in a few weeks, and there'll be plenty more to discuss. So thanks again to everybody, and I look forward to getting together again.